welcome back to the Vulnerable Space with Joyson, the very first episode, the kickoff to this journey of me sharing, opening up, and really being vulnerable. If you haven't already checked out the prelude episode, the introduction to me and to this podcast journey, I would definitely recommend watching it. I just want to start with a Happy New Year. Yeah, we're here. We're alive in this miraculous universe, and we've made it through so much to get to this point and to get to this year already. And I think at the beginning of every episode, I want to begin with gratitude, or begin with something positive, something to be appreciative of and over. As you can tell from the title of this video, finding self-acceptance after struggling with my sexuality, with shame and judgment, that is quite a topic that can be uncomfortable, that can be controversial, as it was for me. And when I was figuring out what I should do, or what I should talk about, what I should be open and vulnerable about for this first episode, this was probably at the end of the list. Like, this probably was going to be episode 10 or the last episode of the season. But part of me was like, no, I think I should start with what's probably been one of the most uncomfortable, one of the most challenging, and one of the biggest parts of my journey of self-acceptance and self-love in my life. And that honestly has been recognizing this truth about me in the area of sexuality that is quite different from the norm, quite different from what I saw, from what I was around growing up in a very heteronormative, patriarchal Western culture. And this journey, this challenge, this realization for me started at a fairly young age. When I was young, I knew I was different in so many ways, especially from other boys who I mainly spent my time with and was around in school, at church, in my Boy Scout troop. I was quite different. I was not into sports. I was terrible at basketball. I'll never forget trying out for the boys basketball team in middle school and missing every shot. I'll also never forget being a part of the soccer tryouts and being hit in a certain area. And let's just say that experience did not make me very fond of soccer. But I was very much into the arts. I was very creative, into drawing, painting, sculpting, working with my hands. And those were two of the ways that I really stood out. But I knew that I also stood out in another area of attraction. I can't quite recall when, but there was certainly a point in my adolescent development where I felt feelings of attraction towards other males. At the time, I don't think I knew of terms like gay or homosexual or queer that are often used to refer to those that experience attraction to the same sex. All I knew was I had these feelings that didn't seem to be common among other men. But what I soon came to understand is that those feelings that I was experiencing were unacceptable, shameful, and abominable. Like many others, I grew up seeing this picture of man and wife in marriage and having a family. That was the tradition, that was the standard, that was the expectation and the hope for me, that desire to be married to a woman and have a wife and have children. So I knew that these feelings I was having was quite in contrast to that picture. I would think that if I am to have this desire in this family, my desire and my attraction should be towards women, girls. But honestly, the level of attraction that I began to have for the same sex, for other males, was not the same as the level of attraction that I had for girls. I grew up with a mom who was very religious. She loved the Lord. Of course, having that kind of mom involved me going to church, heavily being involved in the Christian faith, in the Christian community. In part of that experience, what I heard, what I observed, what I seen was this very shameful, judgmental view of same-sex attraction. There was almost this feeling or this sense of disgust at the idea of a man having love for another man or of a woman having love for another woman. This disgust and this harsh judgment and this dehumanizing view was often justified and supported by text in scripture, deeming it sinful and shameful to experience sexuality between the same sex. I internalized a lot of these messages for myself. I had those same feelings of disgust and shame and judgment towards the attraction that I had been experiencing and developed myself. I had that same view of looking at those that were openly engaging in same-sex behavior or same-sex relationships as acting outside of what is righteous, of what is pure, and of what is holy. I adopted that kind of thinking and that ideology, one, because of the views and the teachings that I was surrounded by, but also out of fear. Growing up being taught that there is this eternal damnation for those that engage in sin, that are attracted to the same sex, was a belief or a fear that I began to have for myself. Me having these feelings was going to send me to that same eternity of burning. When I began to experience these feelings, I didn't talk to anyone about them. I don't think that I felt safe or comfortable enough with my feelings to actually be able to share them. The feelings themselves bringing me discomfort, bringing me shame and fear because of my religious background and because of the ideology that I adopted. I couldn't accept them, and so I didn't. As a matter of fact, I pretended as though these feelings didn't exist. I acted as though I was not experiencing these feelings in hopes that they would disappear, in hopes that it was just a phase of my life, in hopes that they would go away, especially as I prayed. I also didn't talk to or express them openly out of fear of what others, including my family, including my friends, would think of me. The reality was, while I was experiencing these, I noticed how other boys that might have been seen as more effeminate or feminine were treated, how they were called slurs, how they were bullied, and how really they were ostracized. I think that fear I had was quite justified. It is a reality that people within the LGBTQ plus community often experience rejection, often experience abuse and oppression globally, simply because of their experience of being attracted to the same sex or having a different gender identity. I hope that these feelings would go away and wouldn't last very long. This attraction I had to other guys would go away. It didn't. As a matter of fact, as I reached puberty and my hormones began to be a little different and changes in my body, that desire manifested into physical ways. That desire manifested in the kind of things I would look at online, and also in my experience of intimacy and experimentation, maybe at a young age and into maturity. Where I know that my relationship with religion shifted drastically after my mother passed away. This is a topic that I'll be discussing and really going into depth about more in a future episode. But for this particular episode, I want to focus on how that separation from religion kind of distanced myself from the idea of God that I held, as well as a lot of the ideologies that I had adopted growing up. I went from questioning me to questioning God. Where did these feelings come from? Why me? Why must I be judged and shamed for feelings I did not choose to have and that I can't control and that aren't going away no matter how much I prayed and didn't want them to be a part of me? And also questioning all the teachings I learned. What I realize now is that my questions about God, about the teachings, maybe more should have been for those that were teaching me those things and those that had portrayed to me this idea of God. As I reflect now, I kind of hold gratitude for that separation that I experienced because I believe that the teachings I had adopted and the view of God that I held was untrue, was false, and was damaging. A lot of the associations that I had with God were hell, were judgment, and punishment. And despite being taught that God is all loving and that I am loved by God, these were the three characteristics that the teachings around me or what I felt inside were most attributable to God. Additionally, I began to question all the views I absorbed about same-sex attraction. Why is this segment of people so focused on and so deemed the worst of the worst when there are people who aren't attracted to the same sex but are still very much involved in a lifestyle that was contradictory to the commandments set in scripture, right? That includes guys attracted to women having sex before marriage, or guys attracted to women mistreating them, abusing them. There were so many contradictions and questions that I began to have and had the freedom to have since I started to have this separation from all the things I had been taught growing up. In a way, it was quite freeing for me to have those questions and have those thoughts, as opposed to this very linear view of what's right and wrong, of what's acceptable and not acceptable. This very limited view of God and God's love for me, as well as my love for myself. While I was asking these questions and kind of distancing myself from God and religion, I was still struggling very much. Even if my critiques were valid, so was the societal unacceptance and the societal oppression against people that were openly expressive or experiencing their sexuality. And so for so many years after my mother had passed away, I not only remained in silence and in shame about my experience of sexuality, I also remained in silence about losing my mother. That was something that I didn't talk about. For 4 years, between the ages of 14 and 18, was a bunch of confusion, was a bunch of life, was a bunch of me not sharing and not being able to talk about things that I either was afraid to, ashamed of, and not ready to accept and embrace. There was a point in my journey where I became severely depressed and I just stopped going to school. I would just stay in my bed and I would really cope in ways that were unhealthy. But I'll never forget the day that I spoke with my counselor in high school. And for the first time, I opened up about losing my mother. And I felt this weight being lifted off of my shoulders. I felt that I actually gave myself the ability to grieve. There was a flood of tears that were coming out. But it was such a release from my mind, my spirit, and my soul. And I was like, wow, this is how it feels to actually share about what I've been keeping in secret and in silence. It was almost like I saw everything totally differently. And after that I became more courageous to experience grief and accept my mother's loss and talk about it. But I was still in hiding, in silence, and in shame about that other thing, my sexuality, my feelings that I had been experiencing, my attractions, that also I knew that I couldn't remain in silence and shame. I didn't know how, I didn't know when I was going to express or talk about it with anyone, but I knew that the first step for me was to accept it for myself. I had to embrace it, and I chose to, regardless of the judgment and the shame I had about it and how I felt others were going to treat me. I had to accept my feelings and my experience of sexual attraction. And that is what I chose to do. I told myself that This is something I may not want to have. This is something I experienced. This is something I wish I didn't have and that I prayed and really wish would go away. But the fact of the matter is, it's my truth. It's my experience. And in being vulnerable, it's really accepting and expressing those truths that may be hard for us to ourselves or that are going to be hard for others too. And I know that when I chose to accept just my truth, just my reality, what before was rooted in shame and silence became this acceptance, but also this empathy. I became more accepting of others. The views that I had adopted about other people who dealt with the same thing turned into acceptance. I realized that loving myself, accepting myself didn't require me to agree or want to have. It started with just realizing that I'm still lovable. I'm still worthy. I'm still beautiful. I'm still divine, and there is still an amazing divine plan for my life. I adopted those beliefs and it turned into really grace. It turned into compassion and it turned into empathy for others, not just other people that were experiencing or had openly been expressive about their sexuality, but for everyone. For straight people who might be dealing with fornication, for people who might be incarcerated for doing something that they shouldn't have. The grace and acceptance that I had for myself extended so much beyond me. And what I've come to realize is that grace, that acceptance, that love is more in alignment with the Creator, with God, with Scripture, than all of the harsh judgment, all of the rejection, all the oppression against people that are attracted to the same sex or a part of the LGBTQ community. My deconstruction of fear and shame and silence became acceptance and courage. I very much still had discomfort. I very much still am finding acceptance and finding self-love, but I had gained the courage to be open about it and express myself and be truthful and honest, just as I'm doing in this very first episode. What I realize now is I had grown up with a bunch of lies. I had grown up with a bunch of false teachings and a bunch of hypocrisy. The reality is that these signs that I saw sometimes of God-hating gay people is completely false and not rooted in the foundation of love and grace and acceptance. I had realized that this hypocrisy of hyper-focusing on this one sector of people while turning a blind eye to all the other forms of sin, like lying, like over drinking, like bullying and bigotry, seemed more worthy of all the criticism than the criticism and the harsh critique of those whose experience of sexuality hasn't been so linear. Another important part of my self-acceptance journey was education. I really began to study what scripture in the Bible said for myself instead of just listening and believing all the ideas that I'd been taught. And in doing so, I learned about how Christ himself was one that stood up for those and advocated for those that were looked down upon for how they acted out or for how they didn't fit into the societal norm. How he actually spoke up against those that were hateful and that were judgmental and that were shameful over those people. I began to realize that God did not isolate or hyper-focus on one sector of people for their one struggle, but how God's judgment was really extended to all, for all forms of sin, for all forms of immorality. I also realized that there was nowhere in Scripture that refers to the experience of same-sex attraction as a sin. I'll put a link in the comments of some videos I made on TikTok about other things that I learned and realized about the Scripture's views of sexuality and same-sex attraction, and really critiquing that idea that God is unaccepting or unloving of people with same-sex attraction. I also begin to educate myself around sexuality. I desire to know how these feelings and desires came about for me, really from a scientific standpoint. And I begin to understand how sexuality has been expressed in many different ways since the beginning of human time. I begin to realize how sexuality wasn't this thing that is solid or stuck in stone, but is influenced by biology, by the environment, by life experiences. Overall, a lot of the teachings that I have been taught that this way of being is a choice, that this way of being is worthy of judgment and ostracization as oppression, were falsehoods. I'm in a place now where I've reconnected with faith, I've reconnected with God and even scripture, but in a way where I had to find that acceptance and that love for myself and that truth of God's desire for us to love ourselves and one another just as we love ourselves, in a way that is with grace, that is with forgiveness, that is with kindness. And I think that's been so healing for me, realizing despite how the world may feel or what the world may judge me for, that I am acceptable and I am loved by God and I should love myself, but also that I am flawed. So that does not put me in a position to judge or be hateful or shameful over myself or anyone else, as we are all made in the image of God and the Creator. It's been a very long and a very difficult journey of being in the place where I'm able to be open in front of a camera, talking about my truth, talking about my experiences, talking about my reality. But it's been very liberating and it's been very freeing, and it's given me a desire to love myself, but also to love others more, but to also stand up and be an advocate for those that are living in shame, that are living in silence because of those same fears, of those same ideologies that I grew up experiencing and that I grew up having. I think I want to end with a reminder to love and accept yourself. Despite what it is that you don't feel right about, despite what it is that the world may judge you for, I think that you have to start with recognizing it's your truth, it's your reality, and you have to accept it, even if you don't like all parts of it. But also a reminder that you want to separate yourself from the teachings and from beliefs that bring you shame and that cause you not to feel that you can be open about what you're dealing with and what you're experiencing. I also want to leave with a reminder to be accepting of others with differences. We may not understand or have all the answers to why someone is different or acts this way outside of what we've been taught, but that doesn't give us a right to bully or call them names or think that the very being, divine creator of all things who created them is unloving and unaccepting of them and wants you to mistreat them. I also share that I think it's very important to find community of those that you feel safe and comfortable enough to be open about with the things that you might not want to share. And so fortunately, I found comfort and trust in another guy who had also been experiencing the same things. It's also important to be a part of community who have different beliefs than you and who might be quite different from you, so you can begin to educate yourself and learn that maybe these things I've been taught about these people isn't so true. Or maybe these people hold truths that I was ignorant about and didn't fully understand. If you currently don't feel that you have someone close to you in your life that is safe for accepting of you being open about a struggle that you're having, you might want to consider professional help. I know for me, working with a somatic healer was helpful for me to deal with the trauma of not only losing my mother, but also to navigate that journey of being and living in my authentic truth and being able to express my authentic self while also adopting more positive beliefs, more accepting beliefs around myself, around other people, and around the natural experience of sexuality that is nuanced and that is different and that is not the same for everyone. If you made it to the end, I first want to thank you for watching and listening. I really want to open this up for discussion, for conversation. So you have comments, questions, or want to share about your own personal experience, I invite you to send me an email or to leave a comment. Don't forget to leave a like or subscribe if you learned something and want to continue to be a part of this journey of vulnerability. I hope that you'll join me again in the next episode of The Vulnerable Space with Joyson.